What exactly is the purpose of the Memorandum of Association and what exactly are its contents? So, broadly speaking, the purpose of the memorandum is to provide for the distribution of three things. Number one, the profit. Number two, the risk. And number three, the control within the company. And as I've already mentioned in my earlier lecture, generally speaking, the memorandum governs the relationship between the company and the outside world. Because when I mention the list of the clauses that have to be included in the memorandum, you will see that first of all, the company has to identify the name by which it is going to be incorporated, and of course the purposes and the objects for which the company is formed. So for an outsider, the memorandum basically serves as the source of a definition, or you can say the purpose or the capacity of the company, and the main idea is that through the memorandum, the company basically speaks to the world, that is, all the outsiders are communicated about the purpose of the company, its name, its objects, its main line of business, that is the principal line of business, its status, that is whether it's a limited company or an unlimited company, or whether it's a public company or a private company, and what the capital structure of the company is. And this will become much clearer once we consider the contents of the memorandum, that is, as to what exactly goes in. So there are 6 clauses that have to be included in the Memorandum of Association. So the first clause is the name clause, the second one is the registered office clause, the third one is the objects clause, the fourth one is the limited liability clause, the fifth one is the capital clause, and the sixth one is the association clause. And don't worry, I'm going to explain what each of these clauses includes. But one point that you need to note before we do that is that as far as the fourth clause, that is the limited liability clause, is concerned, then obviously an unlimited company, that is a company with unlimited liability, does not have the limited liability clause. And of course, if a company does not have a share capital, then there is not going to be the capital clause either. That is, the fifth clause is not going to be included in a company that does not have share capital. Okay, so now I'm going to explain what each of these clauses actually means. Okay, so the first clause is the name clause, and this one is pretty simple. So if you can recall, we've already discussed that for every kind of company, there is a requirement to add certain words to the end of the name. For example, if it's a single member company, then SMC Private Limited has to be added, and if it's a public company, then simply the word limited has to be added, and if it's a private company, then the word private limited has to be added. So depending on what the kind of company is, the name clause has to mention that particular word along with the company's name. Next, we have the registered office clause, and here you simply have to state the province in which the registered office of the company is to be situated. So for instance, if you are based in Sindh, then you simply state that the registered office of the company will be situated in the province of Sindh. And the third clause is very important because an outsider would need to know what the principal line of business, that is what the objects of your company are. And it is this clause that is going to communicate to all outsiders what the principal objects of the company are. And what exactly do we mean by principal line of business? Well, it simply means the business in which substantial assets of the company are held, or the business through which the substantial revenue of the company is going to be earned. And generally speaking, a company is free to carry on any business that is lawful and is not prohibited by any law in Pakistan. And also remember that even though this particular clause states that the principal line of the business may be, for example, dealing with the export or import of textiles, but that does not mean that the company cannot undertake any activity that is not directly related to the import or export of textiles. In other words, even though the principal line of business of the company may be pertaining to the import or export of textiles, however, always remember that any company usually has to undertake certain transactions that are connected in one way or the other to the principal line of business, but these other activities, that is these activities that are not directly related to the principal line of business, are still necessary in order to attain the main business activities, that is the main business objectives of the company. So in other words, the company is allowed to undertake certain activities even though they may strictly speaking be beyond the principal line of business. But that does not mean that that particular act of the company is going to be considered as ultra vires. And by the way, if you're not familiar with what ultra vires means, it simply means doing something which is outside, that is beyond the powers of the company. So any act that the company does which is outside the objects and the powers of the company is going to be considered as ultra vires. And this is precisely why this particular clause, that is the clause relating to the principal line of business, is so important, because it defines the legal capacity of the company, or in a way you can say that it kind of draws a boundary beyond which the company cannot act, that is a boundary that the company cannot cross. And this is very important because, like I said, any act which does cross this boundary is going to be considered as ultra vires. And as per section 500 of the Companies Act, if any business or part of the business carried on or any transaction made by a company is ultra vires, then this is going to be an offense, and every person who acts as a director or officer of this company and is responsible for carrying on such business is going to be liable to a penalty of level 3. So remember that acting ultra vires is a serious offense. And since I have already mentioned this topic, let me give you an example to clarify this further. So let's say that if a company was formed originally to carry on a coal supply business, and the principal line of business is stated in the Memorandum of Association as something like this company is going to carry on the business of supplying coal and to carry out all such other activities that are necessary to the attainment of that object. Now notice that this particular clause simply sets the limits of the company's power. So if this company has been formed as a coal supplying business, then obviously it cannot start entering into transactions to start let's say selling cars or maybe mobile phones. Why? Because the objects clause, that is the principal line of business, as stated in the Memorandum of Association, has stated that this company does not have the legal capacity to do anything other than supplying coal, and of course to carry out transactions which are related directly to that particular object. And to give an example of the kinds of actions that are going to be related to that object, you can imagine anything. So for example, maybe it needs to buy a truck which is going to be used to transport that coal, and so on and so forth. So anything that's related to that object is fine, but anything that's totally unrelated to the main object of forming the company, then that is going to be counted as ultra vires. So in short, the coal supplying company cannot suddenly start selling mobile phones because it has no legal capacity to do so, and all such transactions that it undertakes which are not within its capacity are going to be counted as ultra vires. And ultra vires simply means acts that are beyond the powers of the company. Okay, so while discussing the third clause, it may seem like we went a little bit off topic, but this was not off topic. This was a very important detour because the details regarding the principal line of business and the doctrine, that is the concept of ultra vires, is extremely important. Okay, so the fourth clause is pretty straightforward. It's the liability clause, where the company has to state, for example, if it's a company limited by shares, then it has to state that the liability of the members is limited. And if it's a company limited by guarantee, then it has to state that the liability of the members is again of course limited. But here an additional sentence has to be added in order to clarify the extent of liabilities of the members of that company in the event that the company is wound up. And finally, if it's an unlimited company, then it has to be stated in this particular clause that the liability of the members is unlimited. Next, we have the share capital clause, and this one's pretty straightforward. That is, the company has to state its authorized share capital, that is the amount of share capital with which the company proposes to get registered, and also the division into shares of a fixed amount. And other details also have to be added. For example, it has to state that every subscriber to the Memorandum of Association is required to take at least one share. And of course, if it's a company limited by guarantee, then this clause is not going to be included if the company does not have a share capital, because remember that it is possible for a company limited by guarantee to have a share capital, but it totally depends. So if the company limited by guarantee does have share capital, then this share capital clause is going to be included in their memorandum of association, otherwise not. And now I'm already aware that this video has crossed 10 minutes, and usually I endeavor to keep my videos short. But this deals with a very important topic and I could not exclude any of the details. But I hope you can bear with me for just one more minute, because now we are discussing the 6th clause, that is the association clause. And by the way, you could say that this is not the 6th clause, it's basically the very last para, and it is also known sometimes as the subscription clause. So I've reproduced a sample of this clause on the screen and you can see that for yourself. So it simply states that it is these people, let's say X, Y and Z, and these are their names and addresses, and they desire to form a company and they are now subscribing to this memorandum of association, and that each of these people agrees to take on the number of shares as stated in this memorandum. So finally, we are done discussing the memorandum of association, and in the next lecture we are going to discuss the articles of association.